Every night, a poor girl watched from a distance as a millionaire lay dying, until one silent night, she walked into the hospital and whispered something in his ear. Suddenly, the man began to react in an inexplicable way. The doctors, stunned, could not believe what they were witnessing. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, tell us which city you're watching us from, and we'll keep going. There was absolute silence in room 307 at Santa Cruz Hospital. The white aseptic walls seemed to absorb any sound, creating an atmosphere of suspension in time. The only perceptible movement was the rhythmic rise and fall of Hector Valdez's chest, a man who until a few moments ago seemed more like a statue than a living being. Hector had been there for 5 long years, in a deep sleep that the world called a coma. His face, once expressive and full of life, was now pale and marked by time. His hair, once carefully combed, was now a messy grey lock that framed a serene, almost ethereal expression. Then something changed. A slight twitch of the eyelids, so subtle that it might have gone unnoticed. But to Nurse Elena, who was making her nightly rounds, that small movement was like an earthquake. "Dr. Miller!" she shouted, running into the hallway. "Come quickly, Mr. Valdez, he's moving." Dr. Miller, a middle-aged man with tired eyes hidden behind thin-rimmed glasses, hurried into the room. He approached the bed, observing the patient closely. "Hector! Hector, can you hear me?" the doctor called, his voice a mixture of expectation and professional caution. Hector's eyes opened slowly, like heavy curtains being lifted after years of being closed. The light in the room, though soft, seemed to hurt him, and he blinked several times, trying to adjust. Where am I?" His voice came out hoarse, almost unrecognizable to himself. "You're at Santa Cruz Hospital, Mr. Valdez," Dr. Miller replied, checking the patient's vital signs. "You had an accident 5 years ago and have been in a coma ever since. It's a miracle you woke up." 5 years. The words hit Hector like a punch to the gut. 5 years of his life lost, swallowed, up by a black void from which he had only just emerged. He tried to move, but his body didn't seem to respond properly to his brain's commands. "Take it easy, Mr. Valdez," Elena said, gently adjusting the pillows. "Your body needs time to readjust. Don't overexert yourself." Hector closed his eyes again, trying to process the information. 5 years. What had happened to his life during that time? His company, his projects, his family. Everything seemed to have been swallowed by a black hole, leaving only a confusing void in its place. "My brother, Eric," Hector murmured, opening his eyes again. "Where is Eric?" Dr. Miller and Elena exchanged quick glances, a silent communication that did not go unnoticed by Hector, even in his weakened state. "We will contact your family immediately. Mr. Valdez," the doctor said, avoiding a direct answer. "For now, it is important that you rest and allow your body to recover." But Hector didn't want to rest. He wanted answers. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness made him back down. Frustrated, he realized how weak he was, how much control he had lost over his own body. "Please," he said, his voice a little firmer now, "I need to know what happened. My company, my business." "All in good time, Mr. Valdez, Doctor," Miller replied with a smile that was meant to be reassuring but didn't reach his eyes. "Now we're going to run some tests to assess your condition." As the doctor and nurse moved around the room, preparing equipment and taking notes, Hector tried to organize his thoughts. His memories seemed fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle, scattered in his mind. He remembered being in his office, working late on a new real estate project. After that, nothing. An absolute void until the moment he opened his eyes in that hospital room. The morning wore on, and with it, an endless series of exams and tests. Hector submitted to them all, anxious to show that he was fine, that he could return to his life. But every movement was a challenge, every word an effort. His body, once strong and vigorous, now felt like a fragile and unfamiliar prison. It was late in the afternoon, when the sun was already setting on the horizon, painting the sky with orange tones that filtered through the gaps in the blinds, that Hector heard a familiar voice in the hallway. "Where is he? I want to see him now." Eric, his younger brother. The voice was unmistakable, but there was something about it that Hector didn't recognize. An urgency, a harshness that didn't match the Eric he knew. The door opened and Eric Valdez stormed into the room. His eyes, so similar to Hector's, were wide, a mixture of surprise and something else, but fear, relief, Hector couldn't decipher. "My God, Hector," Eric said, approaching the bed. "It's true. You really are awake." Hector tried to smile, but the muscles in his face didn't seem to cooperate fully. "Eric," he managed, "what happened? The company—" Eric waved his hand dismissively. "Don't worry about that now, brother. The important thing is that you're back." But there was something in Eric's tone of voice, in the way his eyes avoided direct contact, that sent a chill down Hector's spine. Something was wrong, very wrong. "Eric, please," Hector insisted. "I need to—" "So? 5 years is a long time. What happened to our business, our projects?" The youngest Valdez hesitated for a moment, as if carefully choosing his next words. "Hector, you have to understand, a lot has changed. The company, well, it's had to adapt. I've had to make some tough decisions to keep it going." Hector felt his heart race. "What kind of decisions?" Before Eric could respond, Dr. Muller entered the room, interrupting the conversation. "Mr. Valdez, we need to run a few more tests. Mr. Eric, if you would excuse us for a moment." Eric nodded, looking almost relieved by the interruption. Sure, Hector, rest. We'll talk more when you're stronger." As Eric left the room, Hector couldn't help but notice the look his brother exchanged with the doctor. A look loaded with hidden meanings, with unspoken secrets. At that moment, lying in his hospital bed, surrounded by machines and people who seemed to know more about his life than he did, Hector Valdez was certain that his awakening was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. A journey to recover not only his health, but his identity, his place in the world. And as night fell over the city, bringing with it the shadows and secrets that darkness holds, Hector closed his eyes not to sleep but to prepare himself. For something told him that the battle that awaited him would be the most important of his life. Night fell over the city, transforming the metropolis into a sea of twinkling lights. However, for Elisa Rios, the darkness that was settling in was more than just the absence of sunlight. It was a constant reminder of the struggle she faced every day since her life had been turned upside down. Sitting in the waiting room of the municipal hospital, Elisa watched the incessant coming and going of doctors, nurses, and patients. Her eyes, tired and red from crying so much, were fixed on the door of the room where her younger brother, Victor, was fighting severe pneumonia. "Miss Rios," Dr. Moretti's voice pulled Elisa from her thoughts. "Can we talk for a moment?" Elisa stood up, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. At 23, she carried responsibilities that no one her age should have to bear. "How is he, doctor?" he asked, his voice shaking with concern. Dr. Moretti hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Victor is stable, but his condition is still serious. He requires intensive care and specialized medications." Elisa felt her heart tighten. She knew what was coming next. "The problem, Elisa, is that these treatments are expensive. The hospital cannot continue providing them without payment. I am sorry, but if there is no way to cover the costs, we will have to transfer Victor to a public hospital within 24 hours. The words hit Elisa like a punch in the gut. She knew that public hospitals were overwhelmed, that the lines were long and resources were scarce. Victor would not survive a transfer under these conditions. "Please, doctor," Elisa begged, tears streaming down her face. "There must be something we can do. He's all I have left." Dr. Moretti placed a comforting hand on Elisa's shoulder. "I understand your situation, I really do. But my hands are tied. Unless you can get the money by tomorrow night, I won't have a choice." Elisa nodded mechanically, feeling numb. As the doctor walked away, she returned to the hard chair in the waiting room, her mind a whirlwind of desperate thoughts. How did they get to this point? The question echoed in her mind, bringing up memories she had struggled to keep buried. 5. Years ago, their life was completely different. They lived in a simple housing complex, but they had a home. Their mother, Clara, worked hard as a seamstress to support them. It wasn't a life of luxury, but they were happy. Then, on a day that seemed like any other, everything changed. Elisa vividly remembered the deafening noise of the machines, the dust filling the air, the people screaming and running. The Valdez company had decided to demolish the housing complex to make way for a new luxury development. There was no warning, no time to prepare. In the chaos that followed, Clara disappeared. Elisa spent days searching for her, screaming her name amidst the rubble, but it was in vain. Her mother had disappeared without a trace, as if the dust from the demolition had swallowed her. Suddenly, Elisa found herself alone, responsible for an 8-year-old brother. They were bounced from place to place, first to be a temporary shelter, then a neglected orphanage, and finally, the unforgiving streets of the city. In the years that followed, Elisa did everything she could to survive and protect Victor. She worked odd jobs, begged for food, slept in dark alleys. Every day was a struggle, every meal a victory. And now, when she finally thought things might get better, that maybe they might have a chance at a normal life, fate played another cruel trick on them. Victor, her sweet little brother, was dying, and she had no way to save him. Elisa looked down at her calloused hands, scarred from years of hard work. What else could she do? She had tried everything, begging for help at churches, asking for loans from acquaintances, even considering actions that went against everything she believed in. It was then that his eyes fell on the television in the waiting room. The evening news was on and a headline caught his eye. Tycoon Hector Valdez wakes up after 5 years in a coma. The name Valdez made Elisa's blood boil. That company, that family were responsible for all the misery she and Victor had endured. They were the ones who had destroyed their home, who had torn their mother from their lives. But as she watched the images of the luxurious hospital where Hector Valdez was being held, an idea began to form in her mind. It was madness, of course, dangerous and probably pointless, but what else did she have to lose? With renewed determination, Elisa stood up. She took one last look at Victor's bedroom door, silently promising that she would return with a solution. "Hang in there, little brother," he whispered. "I'll find a way to save you no matter what it takes." Leaving the hospital, Elisa plunged into the São Paulo night. The cold early morning air seemed to cut her skin, but she barely felt it. Her mind was focused on a single objective: to get to Santa Cruz Hospital, where Hector Valdez was. The journey was a journey through the bowels of the city. Elisa took crowded buses, walked through deserted streets, always alert, always cautious. Years on the streets had taught her to move like a shadow, invisible to those who didn't bother to look. When he finally arrived at Santa Cruz Hospital, the contrast with the public hospital where Victor was being treated could not have been more striking. Here everything was sparkling clean. The corridors were wide and well lit, and the air smelled of expensive disinfectant. Elisa hesitated at the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. What was she doing? How could she even think about going in there, much less getting close to Hector Valdez? But then the image of Victor, pale and weak in his hospital bed, came back to her. No, she couldn't give up now. She had to try for him. With a deep sigh, Elisa straightened her shoulders and walked into the hospital. She carefully observed the movement, the patterns of the staff, the moments when the hallways were emptiest. After hours of patiently waiting, her opportunity finally arrived. A cleaning cart was momentarily unattended, and Elisa didn't hesitate. Within seconds, she had donned a lab coat she found on the cart and grabbed some cleaning supplies. With her heart in her mouth, she began moving through the hallways, pretending to be busy cleaning. Her eyes scanned every sign, every room number, looking for any clue as to where Hector Valdez might be. That was when she heard voices coming from a room at the end of the hallway. Approaching cautiously, Elisa recognized the face of the man in the bed through the half-open door. It was him, Hector Valdez, the man the news had shown. Elisa felt a wave of contradictory emotions invade her: anger, fear, despair, hope. Everything mixed together in a whirlwind that threatened to consume her. She waited patiently until the room was empty. When the last nurse left, Elisa took a deep breath and entered silently. Hector Valdez seemed to be asleep, his breathing slow and regular. Elisa approached the bed, her steps as light as possible. For a moment, she just stared at him. This was the man behind the company that had destroyed her life. He looked so human, fragile even. Not the monster she had imagined for so many years. Leaning down, Elisa whispered in Hector's ear, "You took everything from me. My mother, my home, my childhood, and now my brother is dying because I don't have the money to save him. If there is any justice in this world, you will wake up and make amends." The words came out like a dammed river finally finding an outlet. Years of pain, anger, and despair condensed into a few whispered sentences. Elisa quickly pulled away, silent tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what she hoped to achieve by this, but somehow it felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Leaving the room as silently as she had entered, Elisa quickly shed her disguise and left the hospital. Night was already giving way to dawn when she finally returned to Victor's side. Sitting back down in the uncomfortable waiting room chair, Elisa allowed herself a small smile. She knew what she had done was crazy, that it probably wouldn't change anything. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. "It's going to be okay, Rafa," he murmured, holding his sleeping brother's hand. "Somehow we'll get through this, I promise." And as the sun rose over the city, bringing a new day full of challenges and possibilities, Elisa finally fell asleep, exhausted but determined. Little did she know that her words had planted a seed that would soon change the course of many lives, including her own. Morning arrived at Santa Cruz Hospital with a different energy. The hallways, normally quiet in the early hours of the day, were in hustle and bustle. Nurses and doctors hurried back and forth, their voices a rising murmur of excitement and concern. At the center of this maelstrom was room 307, where Hector Valdez had spent the last 5 years in a coma. Now, to the astonishment of the entire medical team, he was not only awake but showing astonishing improvement. Dr. Müller, with dark circles under his eyes that betrayed a sleepless night, examined Hector with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "Incredible," he murmured, checking the results of the latest tests. "Mr. Valdez, your recovery is happening at a speed I've never seen before. It's almost as if..." "Like something had completely awakened me," Hector finished, his voice firmer than it had been the day before. He felt different, like a spark had been lit inside him overnight. Hector closed his eyes for a moment, trying to remember. There was something, a dream perhaps, a young woman's voice full of pain and accusation. But try as he might, he couldn't hold on to the details. It was like trying to hold water in his hands. "Dr. Müller," Hector said, opening his eyes with determination. "I need to know exactly what has happened in the last 5 years. My company, my business, everything." The doctor hesitated, exchanging a quick glance with Nurse Elena. "Mr. Valdez, I don't think it's wise to overwhelm you with so much information at once. Your recovery is our priority and..." "Doctor," Hector interrupted, his voice taking on an authoritative tone that left no room for argument. "I've been asleep for 5 years. I don't have any more time to waste. Please bring me all the newspapers and reports you can find about Valdez Empreendimentos from the last 5 years. Recognizing the determination in his patient's eyes, Dr. Müller nodded reluctantly. "Okay, but promise me you won't push yourself too hard. Your recovery is still fragile." As the doctor left to get the requested supplies, Hector tried to sit up in bed. His muscles, atrophied from long inactivity, protested, but he ignored the pain. He had a feeling that something was terribly wrong, and he could no longer sit still. Across town at the municipal hospital, Elisa woke up with a start. She had fallen asleep in the chair next to Victor's bed, and now her neck ached in protest. But it wasn't the physical discomfort that woke her, but the commotion in the room. "What's going on?" she asked, alarmed, seeing the medical staff surrounding her brother's bed. Dr. Moretti turned to her, a tired but genuine smile on her face. "It's a miracle, Elisa. I can't explain it, but Victor's condition has improved significantly overnight. His fever has broken, and his lungs are responding well to treatment. Elisa felt tears well up in her eyes, a mixture of relief and disbelief. Is he going to be okay? We still have a long way to go, the doctor replied, cautiously optimistic. But this improvement gives us more time. Perhaps we can keep him here for a few more days while we work out a solution to the financial issue. As she watched the doctors tend to Victor, Elisa couldn't help but think back to her nighttime visit to Santa Cruz Hospital. Could it be that her desperate act had somehow triggered this turn of events? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. Coincidences happened, and she couldn't afford to believe in miracles. Back at Santa Cruz Hospital, Hector was immersed in a mountain of newspapers, magazines, and financial reports. Every page he turned, every headline he read, made his heart sink even more. It's not possible, he muttered, running his hand through his hair in frustration. How could this happen? The documents painted a bleak picture. Valdez Empreendimentos, once a symbol of innovation and social responsibility, had become an unscrupulous money-making machine. Public housing projects had been abandoned, entire communities had been displaced, and allegations of corruption had been leveled. And in every photo, in every interview, there was Eric, his brother, as the new face of the company. Hector. Eric's voice at the bedroom door made Hector look up from his papers. What is this? Shouldn't you be resting? Hector watched his brother closely. Eric looked nervous, his eyes darting between the documents scattered across the bed and Hector's determined face. Eric, Hector began, his voice calm but thick with an emotion that made his brother take a step back. What have you done to our company? Eric tried to smile, but the result was more of a grimace. Hector, you have to understand. Times have changed. We've had to adapt to survive in the market. Adapt? Hector's voice rose an octave. You call destroying entire communities adapting? Abandoning social projects that were at the heart of our mission? Eric stepped closer, his hands outstretched in a conciliatory gesture. Brother, you've been gone for 5 years. The business world is different now. I've had to make tough decisions to keep the company alive. Hector felt a wave of nausea as he heard his brother's empty justifications. How could they have grown so distant? How had the idealistic young man he knew turned into this cold, calculating man? I want to see the books, Hector said, his voice leaving no room for argument. All of them, and I want a meeting with the board as soon as possible. Eric paled visibly. Hector, be reasonable. You just woke up from a coma. You need to recover before... No, Hector interrupted, his voice sharp as steel. I have already wasted too much time. I will right the wrongs that were committed. In my absence, starting now. At that moment, as the brothers stared at each other, the air in the room felt electric. It was the prelude to a battle that was just beginning, a fight not just for control of a company, but for the soul and values that Hector had always believed were non-negotiable. Outside the hospital, the city continued its frenetic routine, oblivious to the drama unfolding within its walls. But the ripples of this confrontation would soon spread, affecting lives far beyond the Valdez brothers. In his hospital room, Victor opened his eyes, meeting Elisa's worried but hopeful gaze. Sis, he whispered, his voice weak but clear. I had a strange dream. I dreamed we were home again with Mommy. Elisa held her brother's hand, swallowing the lump that formed in her throat. One day, Rafa. One day we'll have a home. Again, I promise. And so, as the sun rose into the city sky, illuminating the skyscrapers and slums with the same golden light, the fates of Hector, Elisa, and everyone around them began to intertwine in ways none of them could have foreseen. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, and the game that would define everyone's future was just beginning. The main office of Valdez Empreendimentos, located in the city's financial heart, was a monument to opulence and power. From the 50th floor, the view of the city was breathtaking, but at that moment, no one in the meeting room was paying attention to the view. Hector Valdez, still visibly dejected but with his eyes burning with determination, sat at the head of the polished mahogany table. Around him, the members of the board of directors watched him with a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed apprehension. "Gentlemen," Hector began, his firm voice echoing through the silent room, "I thank you all for attending this emergency meeting. As you know, I have spent the last 5 years involuntarily away from business. Now that I have returned, I am deeply disturbed by the direction our company has taken." Eric, sitting across the table, shifted restlessly in his chair. His eyes darted nervously between Hector and the other council members. "Brother," he interjected, forcing a conciliatory smile, "it may be rash to make judgments so soon after your return. The company has grown. Our profits have tripled in the last few years." Hector held up a hand, silencing Eric. "Profits, Eric? Is that what this is all about now? Let me show everyone the true cost of those profits." With a gesture, Hector signaled his hastily hired assistant to distribute a series of folders to those present. As the executives leafed through the documents, expressions of shock and discomfort spread around the room. "As you can see," Hector continued, "our practices in recent years have been, to say the least, questionable. Forced expropriations, bribes to public officials, negligence in security matters. The list is long and shameful." A growing murmur filled the room. Some councillors exchanged worried glances, while others seemed genuinely surprised by the revelations. "But, Hector," argued one of the older directors, "you have to understand that the market has changed. We have had to adapt to survive." Hector slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing around the room. "Survive? At whose expense? The families we've evicted? The lives we've ruined? That's not survival. That's predation." While the discussion heated up in the Valdez Empreendimentos office on the other side of the city, at the municipal hospital, Elisa faced her own challenges. "Miss Rios," Dr. Moretti said, her tone gentle but firm, "I understand your concern, but I need to be clear. Although Victor's condition has improved, he still requires intensive care. The hospital cannot continue providing these treatments without payment for much longer." Elisa felt the familiar weight of despair settle in her chest. "Doctor, please, he's all I have. There must be something we can do." The doctor hesitated for a moment, then lowered her voice. "There is a social welfare program that can help in cases like yours, but the process is slow and bureaucratic. I can't promise anything, but I can try to get the paperwork started for you." A glimmer of hope lit Elisa's tired face. "Yes, please. Anything that can help." As Dr. Moretti walked away to get the necessary forms, Elisa turned to Victor, who was sleeping peacefully. She gently stroked her brother's hair, remembering when they were children, how she had promised her mother that she would always take care of him. "We'll make it, Rafa," she whispered. "Somehow, we'll get through this." Back in the Valdez Empreendimentos boardroom, the tension had reached its peak. Hector was now standing, his hands resting on the table as he faced each board member. "I am proposing a radical change in our operations," he said. "We will cancel all projects involving forced evictions. We will resume our social housing programs. And most importantly, we will open an internal investigation into all questionable practices over the past 5 years." The room erupted in Baistii. Protests. Executives shouted about contracts, financial commitments, and the possible fall in the company's stock. But above all the din, Eric's voice rang out. "You can't do this," he shouted, his face red with anger. "You have no authority. The board appointed me CEO in your absence. You can't just come back and undo everything we've built." A tense silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to Hector, waiting for his reaction. For a moment he seemed to falter, the exhaustion of his recent recovery visible on his face. But then his eyes lit with fierce determination. "You're right, Eric," Hector said, his voice dangerously calm. "I don't have the authority yet, but I do have this." He tossed an envelope on the table. "My majority stake in the company, which, I must remind everyone, was never transferred during my absence." Eric paled visibly, his hands shaking as he picked up the envelope. That's not possible. The lawyers said—" "The lawyers were wrong," Hector interrupted. "Or maybe, just maybe, someone misled them. Either way, as of this moment, I am retaking full control of Valdez Empreendimentos. The room fell into a stunned silence. Some of the councillors looked relieved, others apprehensive. Eric, for his part, seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. "You don't understand," he muttered, almost to himself. "What we did. The promises we made. Hector, you don't know what you're getting into." Hector approached his brother, placing a hand on his shoulder. For a moment, the anger in his eyes gave way to a deep sadness. "So tell me, Eric, what exactly have you done in my name?" Before Eric could respond, the door to the meeting room opened abruptly. A man in a suit walked in, his face a mask of professional seriousness. "Excuse me," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "I am Inspector Costa of the Federal Police. We are here to conduct an investigation into allegations of corruption and illegal practices involving Valdez Empreendimentos." The chaos that followed was instantaneous. Executives jumped from their chairs, some trying to flee, others screaming for their lawyers. Eric collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands. Hector, however, remained calm. He turned to Inspector Costa, extending his hand. "Inspector, I am Hector Valdez. I have just resumed control of the company, and I assure you that you will have our full cooperation in this investigation." As the police began to search the office and question the employees, Hector approached the window. Outside, the city continued its frenetic routine, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the top of that skyscraper. His eyes scanned the horizon, stopping for a moment on a distant region where he knew the housing complex his company had demolished years ago was located. A strange feeling came over him, as if something important was connected to this place, something he couldn't quite remember. "What happened here?" he muttered to himself. "And how am I going to fix all this?" As the sun began to set, painting the city sky in shades of orange and red, Hector knew this was just the first battle in a much larger war. A war to regain not just his company, but his integrity, his vision, and perhaps something even more precious that he didn't even know he had lost. And somewhere in the city, in a hospital very different from that luxurious office, Elisa Rios held her sleeping brother's hand, unaware that her life was about to become intertwined with Hector Valdez's in ways neither of them could have imagined. The sun had barely risen when Elisa woke up with a start in the uncomfortable chair next to Victor's bed. The hospital was beginning to wake up, with nurses changing shifts and the first rays of light filtering through the blinds. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Victor said, his voice still weak, but with a touch of humor that warmed Elisa's heart. "Hey, who's the sleepyhead here?" she teased, stroking her brother's hair. "How are you feeling?" Victor shrugged, a gesture that soon turned into a small cough. "Better, I guess. But Elisa, what are we going to do? I heard the nurses talking last night. They said we can't stay here much longer." Elisa's smile faltered for a moment, but she forced herself to maintain it. "Don't worry about it, Rafa. I'm taking care of everything." But the truth was that Elisa was completely lost. The welfare program Dr. Moretti had mentioned was a remote possibility, and time was quickly running out. Meanwhile, across town, Hector Valdez was facing his own tumultuous morning. After a sleepless night in his old apartment, he arrived early at the headquarters of Valdez Empreendimentos, determined to begin the process of restructuring the company. "Good morning, Mr. Valdez." His new assistant, Eva, greeted him as he stepped out of the elevator. "We have a busy schedule today. The federal police have requested more documents. There's a meeting with the legal department in an hour, and—" Hector held up his hand, interrupting her. "Before all of this, Eva, I need you to do something for me. I want all the files related to the Novo Horizonte housing complex demolition project, everything. Plans, contracts, permits, list of residents, everything." Eva blinked in surprise. "Sir, that project was over 5 years ago. I'm not sure if we still have all those files." "Then find what you can," Hector insisted. "It's important." As Eva left to do her job, Hector entered his office, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Ever since he woke up from his coma, he couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was tied to this demolition project. It was as if a distant voice was calling to him, begging to be heard. At the municipal hospital, Elisa paced nervously down the hallway, waiting for Dr. Moretti to appear with news about the assistance program. Her cell phone vibrated in her pocket, and she reached for it with trembling hands. "Hello? Elisa, it's Matteo." Elisa felt a tightness in her chest. Matteo was a former employee of Valdez Empreendimentos, someone she had met during her investigation into her mother's disappearance. "Matteo, what's wrong? Did something happen?" The man's voice trembled slightly on the other end of the line. "Elisa, you won't believe this. Hector Valdez. He's awake." The world seemed to freeze around Elisa. Images of her nighttime visit to Santa Cruz Hospital flooded her mind. How do you know that?" "It's all over the papers," Matteo replied. "He took back control of the company yesterday. Elisa, this might be our chance. If he really didn't know what happened during his coma, maybe we can make him hear the truth about what happened in New Horizon." Elisa closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of hope and fear stir in her chest. "I don't know, Matteo. What if he's just like his brother? What if—" "Miss Rios," Dr. Moretti's voice brought her back to reality. "Can we talk for a moment?" "I have to go, Matteo," Elisa said quickly. "I'll call you later." Putting away her cell phone, Elisa followed the doctor into a small office. Dr. Moretti's face did not bring good news. "I'm sorry, Elisa," she began, her tone compassionate but firm. "We've done everything we can, but the outreach program can't process Victor's case in time." "The hospital? Well, they're demanding he be transferred by the end of the day." Elisa felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "But where to? He still needs care, medication." Dr. Moretti sighed heavily. "There is a public hospital that can take him, but Elisa, you know what it's like there. The lines are long, the resources are scarce." The doctor's words were lost in a distant hum as Elisa struggled to breathe. It was as if the world was crumbling around her once again. Back at Valdez Empreendimentos, Hector was immersed in a pile of documents when Eva rushed into his office. "Mr. Valdez, I found something I think you should see," she said, placing a folder on the table. "It's an unofficial report on the New Horizon project. It appears to have been deliberately omitted from the official record." Hector opened the folder with trembling hands. As his eyes scanned the pages, his face paled. "My God," he muttered, "this can't be true." The report detailed a series of irregularities in the expropriation process. Bribes, threats, even— Hector felt his stomach turn. There was mention of a woman who had caused trouble and had to be removed. "Eva," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I need you to find everything you can on a resident named Clara Rios." As Eva left to do her homework, Hector sat back in his chair, his mind in turmoil. Fragments of memory, like pieces of an incomplete puzzle, danced in his consciousness. A woman screaming, the deafening sound of machinery, a child crying. His phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Eric. "Brother," Eric's voice sounded desperate. "We need to talk. There are things you need to know, things you don't understand." "Enough lies, Eric," Hector interrupted. "I'm finding out the truth on my own. And when I know everything, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do." At the municipal hospital, Elisa sat by Victor's bedside, holding his hand as he slept. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The news about Hector Valdez, Victor's impending transfer, the memory of his mother, everything seemed to be coming to a head. It was then that she made a decision. Taking out her cell phone, she dialed Matteo's number. "Matteo, it's me, Elisa. I need you to do something for me. Find out where Hector Valdez is now. It's time we confront the past." As the afternoon sun bathed the city in golden hues, Hector and Elisa's destinies were about to intersect in a way neither could have foreseen. Long-buried truths were about to come to light, and the consequences would be felt by all involved. In the Valdez Empreendimentos office, Hector looked out the window, observing the city he once thought he knew so well. Now, everything seemed different, as if a fog had been lifted from his eyes. "What have I done?" he muttered to himself. And how can I fix it? Little did he know that the answer to his questions was on the way, in the form of a young woman determined to find justice, not only for herself, but for all those who had been silenced by power and greed. As the afternoon wore on, fate began to weave its invisible threads, bringing Hector and Elisa together for an encounter that would change their lives forever. The truth, long suppressed, was about to emerge, bringing with it the potential for healing or destruction. The sun was beginning to set over the city, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, when Elisa arrived at the imposing Valdez Empreendimentos building. Her heart was beating frantically against her ribs, a mixture of fear, anger, and determination pulsing through her veins. "Are you sure about this?" asked Mateo, who had insisted on accompanying her. His face was lined with concern. Elisa nodded, her eyes fixed on the entrance to the building. "I have no choice, Mateo. Victor needs that treatment, and Hector Valdez is our only chance." Meanwhile, on the 50th floor, Hector was immersed in a pile of documents when Eva rushed into his office. "Mr. Valdez," she said breathlessly, "I found something about Clara Rios." Hector looked up, his entire body tense with anticipation. "What did you find out?" Eva hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Sir, Clara Rios was one of the residents of the Novo Horizonte housing complex. She disappeared on the day of the demolition." The color drained from Hector's face. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "There are no official records," Eva explained, "but I found some unofficial notes. It seems she was leading a resistance movement against the demolition. On the day of the operation, there was a riot and, well, after that, no one saw her again." Hector felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Fragments of memory, like shards of glass, cut through his mind. A woman screaming, the deafening sound of machinery, the crying of a child. "My God," he muttered, "what have we done?" At that moment, the intercom in his office rang. It was the receptionist from the ground floor. "Mr. Valdez, there is a young woman down here insisting on seeing you. She says her name is Elisa Rios and that it is urgent." The world seemed to freeze around Hector. Rios. The same last name as Clara. It couldn't be a coincidence. "Send her up," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Minutes later, which felt like an eternity, the office door opened. Elisa walked in, her eyes blazing with a mixture of determination and suppressed fury. Behind her, Mateo looked nervous, his eyes darting between Elisa and Hector. "Mr. Valdez," Elisa began, her voice surprisingly firm. "My name is Elisa Rios. I'm here to talk about what your company has done to my family and the entire community of New Horizons." Hector felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The young woman in front of him couldn't have been more than 25, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen and lived too much. "Elisa," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "please sit down. I just found out about what happened. Believe me, I'm just as shocked as you." "Ah?" Elisa laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Shocked? You destroyed our lives. My mother disappeared that day, and now my brother is dying because we can't afford his treatment." Elisa's words struck Hector like a bolt of lightning. His missing mother, his sick brother. Suddenly, a crystal-clear memory flashed through his mind. A night in the hospital, a voice whispering in his ear. "It was you," he said, his eyes widening with realization. "You were in my hospital room that night." Elisa was momentarily speechless, surprised that he remembered. Yes, it was me. I was desperate, my brother needed help, and you woke me up," Hector finished, understanding finally dawning on him. "Your words, your pain, and that's what brought me back." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken emotions and painful truths. It was Mateo who finally broke the silence. "Mr. Valdez," he said, stepping forward, "I've worked at this company for years. I always believed we were doing the right thing, but after what happened in New Horizons, I couldn't keep quiet any longer." Hector looked at the man, recognition shining in his eyes. You tried to warn me, didn't you, before the accident?" Mateo nodded sadly. "I tried, sir, but Eric, he said he'd take care of it, that he'd settle everything fairly." The mention of Eric's name made Hector clench his fists. His own brother, using his absence to perpetrate such atrocities. "Elisa," Hector said, turning to the young woman, "I swear I didn't know the extent of what had happened. But now that I know, I will do everything in my power to right those wrongs." Elisa stared at him, years of pain and anger reflected in her eyes. "Words are easy, Mr. Valdez, but what about actions? What are you going to do to help all the families that have been destroyed by your company?" Hector stood, a new determination in his face. "I'll start right now. First, I'll make sure your brother gets the best treatment possible. Then we'll set up a compensation fund for all the affected families. And most importantly, we'll find out exactly what happened to your mother, Elisa. I promise." Chatting. That moment, the office door opened abruptly. Eric walked in, his face a mask of fury as he saw Elisa and Mateo. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "Hector, you can't trust these people. They're just trying to take advantage of the situation." Hector turned to his brother, his eyes cold as ice. "Enough lies, Eric. I know what you did, and now you will tell me exactly what happened to Clara Rios." Eric's face paled visibly. He looked around like a cornered animal before his eyes landed on Elisa. "You," he said, his voice shaking. "You're her daughter, aren't you? You don't understand. I had no choice." Elisa stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "Where is my mother? What have you done to her?" The air in the office grew thick with tension. Long-buried truths were about to come to light, and no one knew exactly what the consequences would be. Hector stepped between Elisa and Eric, his voice firm and determined. "Enough games, Eric. It's time for the truth. We all deserve to know what really happened." As the sun set completely over the city, casting the last colors of the day into the sky, the fate of everyone present in that room was about to change forever. The revelations that would follow would shape not only the future of Valdez Empreendimentos, but the lives of everyone involved in ways none of them could have foreseen. And so, with a heavy heart but determined to face the consequences of his past actions, Hector prepared himself to hear the truth that would change everything. The night that followed would be long, painful, but maybe, just maybe, it would be the first step toward redemption and justice that had been denied him for so long. The silence that followed Hector's demand was palpable. Eric, cornered by the accusations and Elisa's unexpected presence, seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of seconds. His gaze darted nervously between those present, as if searching for a way out that didn't exist. "You don't understand," he began, his voice shaking. Things have gotten out of hand." Elisa stepped forward, her eyes flashing with suppressed anger. "What got out of hand? My mother's disappearance, the destruction of an entire community." Hector placed a gentle hand on Elisa's shoulder, a gesture that surprised her. "Let him talk," he said, his eyes fixed on his brother. "I want to hear everything, Eric, from the beginning." Eric slumped into a chair, running his hands over his face in defeat. "It all started when you went into a coma, Hector. The company was struggling, the investors were nervous. I needed to prove that I could lead, that I could grow the company. And for that you decided to go over hundreds of family?" Mateo asked, his voice full of disappointment. "It wasn't like that," Eric exclaimed. "At first it was just a project like any other. Novo Horizonte was in a valuable area. The profit potential was huge. We thought we could negotiate, relocate the families." Hector shook his head in disbelief. "But that's not what happened, is it?" Eric continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Most of the families accepted the offer of relocation, but some refused to leave, led by Clara Rios." Hearing her mother's name, Elisa felt a lump form in her throat. "What did you do to her?" she demanded. I didn't want anything bad to happen," Eric stammered. "But the investors were pushing. The deadline was running out. We hired a security company to speed up the eviction process." The horror of realization began to spread across the faces of everyone present. "On the day of the demolition," Eric continued, his voice barely audible, "Clara led a protest. She chained herself to one of the houses, along with other residents. Security personnel were ordered to forcibly remove them." Elisa let out a choked sob, her tears finally breaking through the wall of anger she had maintained. Did you hurt? Hurt, did you? No, Eric interrupted, looking genuinely horrified. I swear no one was supposed to get hurt. But in the chaos, the confusion, Clara disappeared. Disappeared, Hector repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. How does someone just disappear, Eric? Eric buried his face in his hands. I don't know. When the dust settled, when we finally got control of the situation, she was nowhere to be found. We looked, I swear we looked, but you decided to cover it all up, Mateo added, his voice thick with disgust. What else could I do? Eric cried, lifting his tear-streaked face. If the truth came out, the company would be destroyed. Everything we've worked for, everything our father built. Hector stepped away from his brother, as if he couldn't bear to be around him. Our father built this company on integrity, Eric. He would never have approved of this. A heavy silence fell over the room. Elisa, who had remained in shock throughout most of the confession, finally found her voice. 5 years, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. 5 years my brother and I lived on the streets. We went hungry. We faced all kinds of dangers. And all that time you knew. You knew and you did nothing. Eric tried to stand up, reaching out to Elisa in a gesture of supplication. I'm sorry, I really am. If I could take it back. Enough, Hector's voice boomed through the room. No more excuses, Eric. What you did, what we did, is unforgivable. Turning to Elisa and Mateo, Hector continued, his voice softer now, but filled with determination. I can't undo the past, but I can promise that I will do everything in my power to right those wrongs, starting now. He walked over to his desk, picked up the phone and dialed a number. Eva, I need you to contact the best private investigator in town. Tell him we have a missing person case to investigate. Also call Santa Cruz Hospital. I want them to prepare the best room and the best medical staff available. We have a patient who needs urgent treatment. Elisa looked at Hector, a mixture of gratitude and distrust in her eyes. You're really going to help us after all this? Hector nodded solemnly. It's the least I can do. But don't think this solves everything. We have a long way to go to correct the mistakes of the past. Turning to Eric, who was still sitting there looking completely defeated, Hector said, As for you, brother, you are hereby removed from all duties in the company until further notice. And I expect you to be prepared to cooperate fully with the investigations that will come. Eric just nodded silently, looking like he had aged decades in just one night. As night fell over the city, shrouding the town in a blanket of darkness, the occupants of that room knew that their lives had been irrevocably changed. Long-buried secrets had been unearthed, and the consequences of those revelations would echo for a long time to come. Elisa, emotionally and physically exhausted, looked out the office window at the city lights coming on. Somewhere out there, perhaps her mother was still alive, and for the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. Hector, for his part, knew that the road ahead would be difficult. Rebuilding trust, correcting past mistakes, facing the legal and moral consequences of the company's actions. It would be an arduous journey. But looking at Elisa, at the strength and determination in the eyes of this young woman who had faced so much, he knew that it was a path he had to take. Let's start over, he said, his voice firm. This time, we'll do things the right way. And so as the night wore on, the first steps towards redemption and justice began to be taken. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. Dawn found Elisa sitting beside Victor's bed, in the Santa Cruz Hospital. The room was spacious and well-equipped, a drastic change from the cramped and chaotic environment of the public hospital where they had been before. Victor slept peacefully, his face more flushed than it had been in days. Elisa had barely slept a wink all night. Her mind replayed the events of the previous day over and over, the confrontation with Hector, Eric's shocking revelations, the promise of help, and the renewed hope of finding her mother. It was almost too much to process. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Hector Valdez entered, looking as tired as she felt. How is he? Hector asked, his voice low so as not to disturb Victor. Elisa hesitated for a moment before answering. Better. The doctors say the new treatment is working. Hector nodded, a slight smile of relief on his face. I'm glad to hear that. Elisa, I wanted to talk to you about the next steps. She stood up, giving Victor one last fond look before following Hector out of the room. In the hallway, Hector seemed to be struggling to find the right words. I've hired the best private detective in town to investigate your mother's disappearance, he began. He's already working on the case, reviewing all records and interviewing people who were present on the day of the demolition. Elisa felt a wave of emotion wash over her. After so many years of fruitless searching, closed doors, and being ignored, finally someone with resources was looking for her mother. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking. But why are you doing all this? You don't even know us. Hector sighed deeply, running a hand through his grey hair. Because it's the right thing to do, Elisa, and because, in a way, I feel responsible. Even if I wasn't aware when it happened, it was my company. It was my policies that allowed something like this to happen. He paused, his eyes drifting to the cityscape visible through the hallway window. Besides, there's something else, something I can't fully explain. Ever since I woke up from my coma, I've been having flashes, fragmented memories, and in many of them, I see your mother's face. Elisa's eyes widened in surprise. You knew my mother? Hector shook his head in frustration. I'm not sure, the memories are fuzzy, incomplete, but there's something there, Elisa, something important that I can't quite reach. Before Elisa could respond, Hector's cell phone rang. He quickly answered it, his face turning serious as he listened. I see, yes, I'll be there in half an hour. Hanging up the phone, Hector turned to Elisa. It was the detective. He found some clues about the day your mother disappeared. I need to go find him. Elisa felt her heart race. I'll go with you. Hector hesitated. Elisa, I don't know if this is a good idea. It could be painful and... It's my mother, Elisa interrupted, her voice firm. I need to be there, I need to know. After a moment of consideration, Hector nodded. Okay, I'll have a nurse keep an eye on Victor. We'll leave in 10 minutes. Meanwhile, in a luxurious apartment in the city center, Eric Valdez stared at the phone in his hands, his face a mask of anguish and fear. On the screen, a message flashed ominously. They are close to the truth. We need to meet. Now. Eric felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew this day would come eventually, but he hoped he had more time. With shaking hands, he typed a reply. Where? The answer came almost instantly. In the place where it all began, where she disappeared. Swallowing hard, Eric stood up. He knew the decisions he made in the next few hours could change everything, but he also knew he had no choice. Back in Hector's car, Elisa watched the city pass by through the window. A metropolis of contrasts where skyscrapers coexisted side by side with slums where luxury and poverty danced a macabre dance every day. Where are we going? She asked, noticing that they were moving away from the center. Hector kept his eyes on the road, his expression serious. To New Horizon, or rather, to what's left of it. The detective found a witness who's never been heard from before. Someone who says he saw your mother the day she disappeared. Elisa felt her heart skip a beat. After so many years, finally a concrete clue, but along with the hope came fear. What if the news was bad? What if... His thoughts were interrupted when the car stopped abruptly. Hector let out a gasp of surprise. What's wrong? Elisa asked, alarmed. Hector pointed to a familiar figure hurriedly crossing the street. Is that Eric? What's he doing here? Without waiting for a response, Hector got out of the car, with Elisa close behind. They followed Eric at a distance, watching him enter an abandoned building, one of the few that remained of the old community. Something's wrong here, Hector muttered. Very wrong. Elisa felt a shiver run down her spine. Something told her that they were about to discover a truth that could change everything, a truth that perhaps was better buried. But there was no turning back now. With cautious steps, Hector and Elisa approached the building, their hearts pounding frantically. Whatever was waiting for them, inside they would face it together. And so, as the morning sun bathed the city in its golden light, two unlikely allies prepared to confront a dark past and an uncertain future. The answers they sought were within reach, but the price of those revelations might be higher than either of them was prepared to pay. The abandoned building loomed like a ghost from the past, its peeling walls and broken windows silently telling the story of lives cut short and dreams shattered. Hector and Elisa entered cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness of the place. The air was heavy with dust and memories. To Elisa, every corner, every shadow seemed to whisper memories of a life that had been brutally ripped from her. To Hector, it was a monument to his failure, a constant reminder of the consequences of his negligence. "This way," Hector whispered, pointing to a staircase that led to the upper floors. They had seen Eric climb this way moments before. As they climbed, the sound of muffled voices began to reach them. Hector signaled for Elisa to be silent, and they both crept closer to a half-open door on the third floor. "We can't let them find out," Eric's voice reached them, shaky and desperate. "If the truth comes out, we're finished." "Calm down," a female voice replied, cold and calculating. "No one will find out if we stay calm." Elisa felt her heart race. That voice, there was something familiar about it, something that made her blood run cold. Hector, in turn, felt a wave of recognition wash over him. That voice belonged to someone he knew well, someone he trusted implicitly. But what was she doing there, conspiring with Eric? Without a second thought, Hector pushed, opened the door, revealing the scene inside the room. Eric stood there, pale and trembling, while an elegant middle-aged woman stared at him with an expression of cold determination. "Helena!" exclaimed Hector in disbelief. The woman turned, her eyes widening for a moment before narrowing. Again. Helena Valdez, Hector's wife, the woman who had been by his side throughout his coma, was now staring at him with a mixture of surprise and calculation. "Hector," she said, her voice controlled, "I didn't expect to see you here." Elisa, who had entered right behind Hector, looked from one to the other, confused and alarmed. "What's going on here? Who is she?" Hector, still stunned by his wife's unexpected presence, replied mechanically, "Elisa, this is Helena, my wife." The shock of the revelation was momentarily interrupted by a muffled scream coming from an adjacent room. Everyone turned toward the sound, and Elisa felt her heart stop for a moment. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Without waiting for a reaction from the others, Elisa ran towards the sound, pushing open a door that was barely holding on its hinges. What she saw made her freeze in place. Sitting in an old chair, bound and gagged, was Clara Rios. Her once black hair was now gray, and her face showed the signs of years of captivity. But her eyes, those eyes that Elisa knew so well, shone with recognition and love. "Mom!" Elisa cried, running to free her. Hector, who had followed Elisa, stood frozen in the doorway. Memories that had previously been only fragments now flooded his mind like a torrent. Clara Rios was not just a resident of New Horizon. She was so much more. "You," he murmured, his legs weakening. "I know you, Helena appeared behind him, her voice sharp as a blade. "Yes, Hector. You know her. Or rather, you did, before your convenient accident." Eric, who had been watching everything with growing horror, finally found his voice. "Helena, what did you do? Why?" Helena laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Because she threatened everything, Eric. Our way of life, our position. Hector was about to throw it all away because of her and that bastard child." Elisa, who had managed to release Clara, turned around abruptly upon hearing this. "What are you talking about?" Clara, finally free of the gag, spoke for the first time, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Elisa, my daughter, there is so much you do not know." Hector stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Clara. The memories were crystal clear now. The secret affair, the whispered promises, the plans for a future together. And then, the accident that had put him in a coma. "You," he said, turning to Helena, "you knew everything. Were you the one who orchestrated the accident?" Helena lifted her chin defiantly. I did what had to be done to protect our family, Hector. You were out of your mind, ready to throw it all away for an adventure. Adventure? Clara's voice trembled with indignation. We loved each other, Helena, and Hector was going to recognize Elisa as his daughter. The world seemed to spin around Elisa. Her mother's words echoed in her ears, impossible to fully comprehend. Hector Valdez, the man she had blamed for years for the destruction of her life, was actually my father, she whispered, looking at Hector with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Hector, in turn, stared at Elisa as if he were seeing her for the first time. The features he had previously attributed to coincidence now screamed the truth. The same eyes, the same determined chin. My daughter, he murmured, taking a hesitant step toward Elisa. The moment of revelation was brutally interrupted by the sound of sirens approaching. Eric, who had remained silent, spoke. I called the police. This has to stop. Helena turned to him, her eyes blazing with fury. You fool! Don't you understand what you've done? But it was too late. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the stairs, and soon the room was invaded by armed police officers. Federal police, nobody move. The chaos that followed was a blur of shouts, orders, and movement. Helena tried to flee, but was quickly detained. Eric surrendered without resistance, looking almost relieved that it was finally over. Hector, Elisa, and Clara were escorted out of the building, still too stunned to fully process everything that had happened. As they were led away to give their statements, Elisa looked at Hector, a silent question in her eyes. Hector, feeling the weight of years of secrets and lies, only nodded slightly. Let's talk, he said softly. There's a lot to be said. And so, as the sun reached its highest point in the city sky, illuminating the rubble of what was once Novo Horizonte, a broken family began to take the first steps towards reconciliation. The road ahead would be long and difficult, full of hurts to be healed and truths to be faced. But for now, in that moment between the dark past and the uncertain future, there was a spark of hope. A hope that perhaps, from the ashes of so much suffering, something new and beautiful could finally blossom. The days that followed the revelations in the abandoned building were a whirlwind of emotions, testimonies, and sensationalist headlines. The press had a field day with the scandal involving the powerful Valdez family, and the city seemed to talk about nothing else. At Santa Cruz Hospital, Elisa sat next to Victor's bed, holding his hand as she explained as best she could the recent events. So, Hector Valdez is our father? Victor asked, his eyes wide with surprise. Elisa nodded slowly. Yes, Rafa, it's a lot to process, I know. Victor was silent for a moment, absorbing this information. What about Mom? Is she really alive? Elisa's voice shook slightly, as she answered, Yes, she is. She's recovering in another room here at the hospital. The doctors say she'll be fine, but it'll take time. At that moment, a soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Hector entered hesitantly, his face showing clear signs of fatigue and worry. Can I come in? He asked, his voice low and uncertain. Elisa looked at Victor, who nodded slightly. Sure, she replied. Hector approached the bed, his eyes flicking from Elisa to Victor. It was clear he was struggling to find the right words. How are you? Feeling, Victor, he finally asked. Better, Mr. Val. Victor hesitated, clearly unsure of how to address Hector. You can call me Hector for now, he said gently. I know this is all a lot for both of you. I don't want to force anything. Elisa watched the interaction with mixed emotions. Part of her still wanted to blame Hector for everything they had been through, but another part longed for this connection, for this family that had been denied to them for so long. How is the investigation going? Elisa asked, changing the subject. Hector sighed heavily. Helena and Eric are in custody. The police are unearthing years of corruption and crime. It's worse than I imagined. And the company? Elisa asked, surprised by her own interest. In chaos, Hector admitted. Her investors are in panic. Stocks have plummeted, but maybe this is an opportunity to rebuild everything from scratch. Do things the right way this time. A thoughtful silence fell over the room, each of them lost in their own thoughts and reflections on the uncertain future that awaited them. It was Victor who finally broke the silence. Can we see Mom?" The question, so simple and yet so full of emotion, brought tears to Elisa's eyes. Hector, visibly moved, replied, "Of course you can. Actually, I was thinking about us all going together, if you guys want, of course." Elisa hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I think she'd like that." They carefully helped Victor to his feet and placed him in a wheelchair. The journey to Clara's room was made in a silence filled with anticipation. When they entered, they found Clara sitting on the bed, looking out the window. When she heard the door open, she turned around, and her eyes immediately filled with tears when she saw her children. "My loves," she whispered, stretching out her arms. Elisa and Victor didn't hesitate. Within seconds, they were in their mother's arms, sobbing and laughing at the same time. It was a hug that contained years of longing, pain, and repressed love. Hector watched the scene from the doorway, feeling simultaneously part of it and an intruder. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze over the heads of her children. "Hector," she said softly, "come here." With hesitant steps, he approached the bed. Clara held out a hand to him, which Hector took gently. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice cracking. "For everything, if I had known—" Clara shook her head. "It wasn't your fault, Hector. We were all victims here." Elisa, wiping away her tears, looked from one to the other. "What happens now?" she asked, giving voice to the question that hung over them all. Hector took a deep breath before answering. "Now we start again. All of us. Together if you want." "It won't be easy," Clara warned. "There are a lot of wounds to heal, a lot of trust to rebuild." "I know," Hector said, "but I'm willing to try if you are." Victor, who had remained silent until then, spoke up. I'd like to try. I've always wanted to have a father." Elisa looked at her brother, then at her mother, and finally at Hector. There was so much to consider, so many conflicting emotions. But deep down, there was also a spark of hope. A hope that maybe they could have the family they had always dreamed of. "One day at a time," she said finally. "Can we start like this?" Hector nodded, a hesitant smile forming on his lips. "One day at a time," he agreed. And so, in that hospital room, a fractured family began to take the first steps toward healing. The road ahead would be long and at times painful. There would be moments of doubt, of resurfaced anger, and of old wounds reopened. But there was also the promise of a new beginning, the chance to build something beautiful from the ruins of the past. And as the sun set over the city, painting the sky with shades of hope, 4 people who had been torn apart and brought together by fate allowed themselves to dream of a future together. The journey of rebuilding was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time, the future seemed to be bright with the promise of better days. 3 months have passed since the revelations that shook the lives of Hector, Clara, Elisa, and Victor. Autumn was arriving, bringing with it winds of change not only in the weather, but also in the lives of those involved in the Valdez scandal. In Hector's penthouse, now transformed into a makeshift home for the newly formed family, Elisa watched the city through the panoramic window. The apartment, once cold and impersonal, now showed signs of life. Freshly taken family photos, Victor's drawings spread across the refrigerator, and the comforting aroma of coffee that Clara was making in the kitchen. "What are you thinking about?" Hector's voice pulled her out of her reverie. He approached, holding 2 cups of coffee. Elisa accepted one of them with a small smile. "How everything changed so quickly. Sometimes it still feels like a dream." Hector nodded understandingly. "I know. Me too." The past few months had been an emotional roller coaster. Adjusting to the new family dynamic had not been easy. There had been moments of tension, heated arguments, and tears shed. But there had also been laughter, hesitant hugs that grew more confident over time, and small daily victories that brought them closer together. "How are things at the company?" Elisa asked, surprised at her own interest in the family business. Hector sighed, running a hand through his grey hair. Complicated, but we're making progress. The restructuring is underway. We're cancelling all questionable projects and focusing on social housing and sustainable development initiatives. And New Horizon? Elisa asked, her voice thick with emotion. A genuine smile lit up Hector's face. This is our priority project right now. We're working with the community to rebuild not just the houses, but the entire infrastructure. Schools, health centers, recreational area. We want to do things right this time. Elisa felt a wave of pride and hope wash over her. It was strange, but little by little, she began to see Hector not just as the cold businessman she had imagined, but as a man determined to right the wrongs of the past. At that moment, Victor entered the room leaning on a cane. His recovery was progressing well, but there was still a long way to go. "Hey, you two," he said, smiling. "What are you plotting about?" Elisa laughed, helping her brother sit on the couch. "Nothing much, just catching up with Dad." The word Daddy still sounded strange in his mouth, but every day it became more natural. Hector, for his part, still got emotional every time he heard it. "Speaking of which," Victor said, "did you see today's headline? Helena and Eric's trial has been set for next month." A heavy silence fell over the room. The subject was still a sensitive one for all of them. "How are you feeling about this, Dad?" Elisa asked softly. Hector took a deep breath before answering. "It's complicated. On the one hand, I know they need to answer for their crimes. But on the other, Helena is still the mother of my other children, and Eric, well, despite everything, he's still my brother." "Have you decided whether you're going to testify?" Victor asked. "Yes," Hector replied, his voice firm. "I will tell you everything I know. It is the least I can do for the victims of your actions." Clara entered the room at that moment, bringing more coffee and some cookies. She smiled at the sight of her family gathered together, still in awe of the reality of having them all together again. "What are you talking about?" she asked, sitting down next to Victor. "About the trial," Elisa replied, "and about the changes in the company." Clara nodded, her face taking on a serious expression. "Speaking of which, Hector, I got a call today. The New Horizon Residents Committee wants to schedule a meeting. They have some concerns about the reconstruction project." Hector straightened, interested. "What kind of concerns?" "They fear that even with the best intentions, the project will end up gentrifying the area," Clara explained. "They want assurances that original families will be given priority and that prices will remain affordable." "I see," Hector said thoughtfully. Perhaps you could join me in this meeting. Your perspective would be invaluable." Elisa and Clara exchanged surprised looks. "Are you sure?" Elisa asked. Hector smiled. "Absolutely. You know the community better than anyone. And besides, well, I think it's time you got more involved in the family business if you want." The proposal hung in the air, full of possibilities. For Elisa, it was an opportunity to make a difference, to use her experience to help those who, like her, had been marginalized. For Clara, it was a chance to ensure that history would not repeat itself, that other families would not go through what hers had. "I'm in," Elisa said finally, a determined glint in her eyes. "Me too," Clara agreed. Victor smiled, proud of his family. "Hey, don't forget about me. I may not be able to go to the field yet, but I can help with the planning and logistics." Hector felt his heart fill with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was a mixture of pride, gratitude, and hope. "Then it's decided," he said, his voice breaking. "We'll do this together." As the afternoon wore on, the Valdez Rios family continued to talk, plan, and dream. There were still many challenges ahead: the trial, rebuilding the company, fighting the prejudice and distrust that the Valdez name now carried. But there, in that room, surrounded by the warmth of affection that grew every day, they knew they could face any obstacle. Together, they were not just a rebuilt family, but a force for change. And as the sun set over the city, painting the sky with shades of hope, Hector, Clara, Elisa, and Victor allowed themselves to dream of a future where the name Valdez was no longer synonymous with greed and corruption, but with redemption, justice, and a new beginning. The journey would be long and at times difficult. But with each small step, With each gesture of love and understanding, they were building not just a family, but a legacy of positive change that would echo for generations. A year has passed since that afternoon when the Valdez Rios family decided to join forces to rebuild not only their lives, but also the community that had suffered so much due to the company's past actions. Summer was arriving, bringing with it not only its characteristic warmth, but also a sense of renewal and hope. In the heart of the former Novo Horizonte housing complex, now renamed Comunidade Renascer, a crowd gathered for the inauguration of the new community center. The building, a modern and sustainable project, stood out as a symbol of the rebirth not only of the neighborhood, but also of Valdez Empreendimentos itself. Hector, wearing a simple shirt instead of the expensive suits he usually wore, watched the scene with a mixture of pride and humility. Beside him, Clara held his hand, a gesture that still made him feel butterflies in his stomach, even after all these months together. "Who would have thought, huh?" Clara commented, smiling. "A year ago, if someone had told me we would be here today." Hector nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Sometimes it still feels like a dream." Not far away, Elisa was surrounded by a group of young residents, excitedly explaining the education and job training programs that would be offered at the new center. Their enthusiasm was contagious, and the young people's eyes lit up at the prospect of new opportunities. Victor, now fully recovered, moved through the crowd with a clipboard in his hand, checking the final details for the opening ceremony. His talent for organization and logistics had proven invaluable over the past year. As the time for the ceremony approached, the family gathered near the makeshift stage. Hector looked at each of them, his heart overflowing with affection and gratitude. "Are you ready?" he asked. Elisa smiled, adjusting the microphone on her blouse. "More than ever, Dad." Victor patted his father on the back. "Come on, you're going to rock." Clara just squeezed his hand once more, her gaze saying everything words couldn't express. Hector stepped onto the stage, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. He took a deep breath, remembering all the lessons learned, all the battles faced, all the moments of doubt and triumph that had brought them here. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice firm but thick with emotion. "A year ago, I was in a hospital room just waking up from a coma, with no idea what had happened to my company, my family, and this community in my absence." The crowd fell silent, absorbing every word. "What I discovered horrified me," Hector continued. "I saw how greed and ruthlessness had transformed something that should have been a force for good into an instrument of destruction and pain. I saw families displaced, lives destroyed, dreams shattered." He paused, his eyes finding Clara's in the crowd. "But I also discovered something wonderful. I discovered a family I didn't know I had. I discovered the strength and resilience of this community. And I discovered that it's never too late to do the right thing." Elisa and Victor went up on stage, positioning themselves next to their father. "This community center," Hector said, gesturing to the building behind him, "is just the first step. It is a symbol of our commitment not only to repairing the damage of the past, but to building a better future together." Elisa took the microphone, her voice full of passion. "Here, we will offer educational programs, job training, mental health support, and more. We don't just want to rebuild homes, we want to rebuild lives." Victor continued. "Most importantly, all of this will be done in partnership with the community. Their voices, their needs, their dreams will be the driving force behind every decision." Hector spoke again, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "I know that words and promises are not enough. I know that trust must be rebuilt, day by day, action by action. But we are committed to this journey, no matter how long it takes." Clara went up on stage, joining her family. Hector handed her the microphone, a symbolic gesture that did not go unnoticed by the crowd. "As someone who has lived both sides of this story," Clara began, "I can say that what I see today fills me with hope. I see a strong, united community. I see a company transformed, and I see a family that, like this neighborhood, has risen from the ashes." As Clara spoke, Hector scanned the crowd. He saw faces marked by the pain of the past, but also lit by the hope of the future. He saw children who now had the chance to grow up in a safe and prosperous environment. He saw seniors who could finally live out their golden years with dignity. The inauguration ceremony came to a close with the traditional ribbon cutting. The emotion was palpable in the air. People hugged each other. Some cried, others laughed. It was the end of a painful chapter and the beginning of a new era. Later, as the crowd began to disperse, the Valdez Rios family gathered in a quiet corner of the new community center. "We did it," Victor said, a wide smile on his face. "No, Rafa," Elisa corrected gently. "We've only just begun." Hector nodded, looking proudly at his children. "Elisa is right. We have a long way to go. But together, we can make a difference." Clara snuggled into Hector's arms, watching the scene around her. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when I was in captivity, there were times when I lost all hope. But something inside me always told me to keep fighting, that one day everything would make sense." "And did he?" Hector asked softly. Clara smiled, looking at her gathered family. "More than I could ever imagine." As the sun set over the Renacer, community, painting the sky with shades of hope and promise, the Valdez Rios family knew that this was just the beginning of their journey. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, old wounds that would still need time to fully heal. But there, in that moment, surrounded by the fruits of their hard work and love, they allowed themselves to feel something that had long seemed impossible: peace. A peace born not of the absence of conflict, but of the knowledge that together they could weather any storm. And so, as the first stars began to dot the city sky, Hector, Clara, Elisa, and Victor walked hand in hand out of the community center, ready to write the next chapter of their lives. A chapter of redemption, of love, and of hope. A chapter that, they knew, would be just the beginning of a much bigger story.